My name is David Matthews, and I was born actually at the Springdale Hospital on April the 13th, 1951. And I've lived my entire life since then in a 7-mile radius of where I was born. My father was Roe Matthews. He was a Baptist preacher. He was preaching in Springdale when I was born, and 10 days before I turned 5, he moved to Lowell. He preached there for 23 years until he retired from the ministry. My mother was a school teacher, Geneva Matthews. She taught for 41 years in the Arkansas public education system before she retired. Well, I have an older brother, J.D. Matthews, who's 9 years older than me. And so being 9 years older, he was gone from the house by the time I was 9 years old. So I don't have a lot of memories of growing up playing with him or anything of that nature, but of course I have a fond relationship with him now. My sister Deborah ultimately married my best friend in high school, Craig Campbell. She was our office manager here in this law firm for over 30 years, and they're still married and still doing well. And then I have a younger brother, Stephen, who lives in Fort Worth, Texas. Well, growing up in Lowell was wonderful. You have to back in 1951 or 55 when I moved there, all the streets in the downtown part of Lowell were not even paved yet. We had a party line telephone system. It was long distance to call across the street from the parsonage to the people that lived on the other side of McClure. Ran around, there was no fear of crime, no fear of people kidnapping kids. Besides that, if they'd kidnapped me, they'd have probably brought me back like the ransom of Red Chief. But it was wonderful. It was a peaceful place. But about 200 people lived in Lowell then, and we all knew each other, and all the kids, played together. So, great place, great school too. Well, Rogers was a distant place to me when I was a kid because my mother taught school in Springdale. So, by nature, we went to the grocery store in Springdale. We went to the department store in Springdale. I'd, get my school clothes at Wilson's on Emma Avenue. So I didn't really know much about Rogers until 7th grade. Of course, kids that went to school in Lowell went to junior high and high school in Rogers. So we'd catch the bus and ride to Rogers, and that's when really my knowledge of Rogers began, and it really increased when I joined the DeMolay chapter in Rogers. I was 13 then, and so at that point my social activities began to be Rogers-centric rather than Springdale-centric. But Rogers was a great place too. I've told people for many years if I was Samantha on Bewitched and could twitch my nose and make something happen, I'd take Rogers back to 1968. Everybody knew everyone. Downtown was thriving. Beaver Lake was just coming in, and it was a wonderful, idyllic place. It was like happy days. I went to the county fair in Bentonville. In fact, in those days, the school bus would take you over to Bentonville for the county fair one day each year, and that was really about the extent of my knowledge of Bentonville. We played them in football and basketball. It wasn't really until I started practicing law that I began to go to Bentonville on a regular basis and became familiar with the square and the courthouse and those things. Well, after high school, I went to the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville. I continued to work, though, at the Holiday Inn in Rogers. So 4 nights a week, I was driving back from Fayetteville to work my shift at the Holiday Inn. It wasn't until I just about to graduate from college, and I got a job in Fayetteville at Perry's Jewelry. So when I was in college, I worked, and sometimes I might skip a class to play touch football, but most of the time I was working and traveling back and forth to Lowell for church on Sundays and Sunday dinner with my folks. Then when I graduated from college, I got married to Mary Beth Musholt, and I started law school immediately. Mary Beth and I ultimately were in law school together. 2 years after I started, she also enrolled in law school, and I tell people we went to law school together. She graduated magna cum laude, and I graduated thankta laude. But my last year in law school, I got a job as a law clerk working for the Kelly law firm, more accurately working for Kelly, Luffman, and Jennings. At that time it was Gene Kelly, Mac Luffman, and John Jennings, who had a law office that was located literally right next door to where we're sitting today. But I clerked for them for a year, and then when I had graduated from law school, of course I wanted a job. I had been working my way through college and law school. I wanted a job that actually paid a salary, and I asked my friend Gene Kelly if he'd give me a job, and he was very nice, but he then gave me the best advice I've ever gotten. He said, "David, you need to go back to Lowell. You grew up there. They've never had a lawyer. You know everybody there. You need to open your own office in Lowell, and you'll be a success." And I said, "Well, Gene, that's great advice, but there's no building available in Lowell, and I don't have 2 nickels to rub together to rent one or buy one." And Gene Kelly, it's incredible to me even now, Gene Kelly said this: "You go find a place to buy, and I will go with you to the First National Bank, and I'll co-sign the loan for you to start your law practice." And he did. We bought a building in downtown Lowell, and the people in the community helped me tear down what was there and use the scrap lumber to rebuild a little 2-room office. And Gene, true to his word, co-signed the loan for me at First National Bank. Carl Baggett was president then, and they loaned me 100% of the money to start my law office. It's just unheard of, such a kind and generous thing. And I'm thankful he didn't have to pay the loan that he had co-signed. Almost immediately, the law practice was a success. It was funny. I mean, I literally didn't know anything. My library consisted of a set of statutes that I bought for $10 a month from the Mishi Company. I had all of the modern conveniences, though. In my little 2-room office, I had a black rotary dial telephone with a hold button. I had a Correcton Selectric IBM typewriter, and when I finally had enough business to justify hiring a secretary, I hired Susan Bright, who was wonderful, but she didn't know how to type. Now, she told me that when we began. I said, "Well, you don't know how to type, and I don't know how to be a lawyer. We'll learn together." And she came to work for me and did a great job, worked for a number of years for first me and then for our firm. But it was great. But you just crazy things happen. I'd been a lawyer about 3 days, and I was sitting in my office with nobody, no secretary, just me, and a guy walks in and looks at me and he says, "Have you got a notorious Republican here?" And I said, "Why, no, sir, I'm a Democrat." He said, "Oh, I don't care anything about your politics. I just need somebody to sign my car title." And I said, "Oh, you mean a notary public?" "Yes, sir, I'm a notary public. I'll be glad to do that for you." But that was just, Gene was right. They'd never had a lawyer in Lowell, and nobody knew what a lawyer was supposed to do, and I didn't really know how to be one. But we got along and did well. Within 6 months, I had 2 secretaries working and had plenty of business. I was also, though, the Lowell City judge. In those days, before Amendment 80, mayor's courts were in all of the small towns, and Lowell had one too, and you didn't even have to be a lawyer to be a city court judge in a mayor's court. And so when I was in law school, I got hired to be the judge for the city of Lowell. I was a judge before I was a lawyer for about a year. I got paid $10 a month to come once a month and hold traffic court. And I ended up having that job for 6 years. And then I resigned as judge when I ran for the Arkansas legislature in 1982. But it was wonderful. I mean, I loved being a lawyer. I loved my hometown. I loved the people of Lowell, and you get to help people in the practice of law. Well, actually, we've just had within the last year a reapportionment. Well, that's what happened in 1980 as well. The 1980 census was done, and so there was a reapportionment of the Arkansas legislature, and Benton County had grown enough that it was entitled to a 3rd legislative seat. And the one that was created was brand new, no incumbent. It went from War Eagle across the southern part of Benton County, took in Lowell, Cave Springs, all the way over to Gentry, Decatur, Gravette, and Sulphur Springs. It was just a big L, and it even included Centerton. Nobody running, so I announced that I would run, and nobody else, I guess, even knew the job was open, because I didn't get an opponent in 1982, and I didn't get an opponent in 1984. And then I did get an opponent in 1986, but I won that race, and then ran again in 88. And at that point, I realized that I really needed to be home taking care of my children rather than being in the legislature. So I didn't run again.
Did you ever think about running for office again, or get approached?
I've been approached many, many times. But once I had cut that cord, I really didn't look back. I thought, I was marginally interested in what was going on, but politics has evolved, and not evolved in a good way, in my opinion. In the 1980s, I was a Democrat from Benton County. Dick Barclay was a Republican, represented Rogers. He was the first Republican elected from Benton County to the state legislature, and the other state representative at the time was Clayton Little. Clayton and Dick and I were great friends. We would carpool back and forth between Little Rock and Lowell, Bentonville, and Rogers. Later, Tim Hutchinson defeated Clayton, and so now you had 2 Republicans from Benton County and 1 Democrat. We still drove back and forth. Dick and I probably didn't vote opposite of each other half a dozen times in 8 years. We just were of like mind. Partisanship did not matter in the General Assembly in the 80s. You were worried about your constituents and your home area. Dick and Tim and I were co-sponsors of the legislation that created the Northwest Arkansas Community College, that converted the College Without Walls from a local endeavor to now, I think, the second largest 2-year college in the state of Arkansas. We knew we needed it, and the people knew we needed it. So that's an example of what people can do when they're willing to work together. I think one of the highest honors that I've ever received was when the Rogers-Lowell Area Chamber of Commerce created an award that's titled the Barclay Matthews Award. And they give it to public servants who work together, who understand that the government service is government service for all people, not just one particular party. I was honored to be even mentioned in the same breath in an award as Dick Barclay. He was a fine, fine, fine man. And the line that I've always used did, Dick Barclay was a Republican before Republican was cool. Ivan Rose had been the state representative for Rogers, and he died while in office. There was a special election called, and Gene Kelly, my old friend Gene, was the Democratic nominee. Dick Barclay was the Republican nominee, and they both ran in primary elections to get the nomination. I think the whole world thought that Gene would win because the Democrat always won. But Dick rolled him up. I think Dick got about 60% of the vote. And Dick Barclay, in my view, started the Republican Party in Benton County, because when people saw that, a Republican could win, then they began to say, we don't have to just vote in the Democratic primary. Most people don't know this. In the 1980s, the Democrats had all of the polling places. Republicans had only a few polling places because the parties had to pay for their primary election locations. So the Republican committee asked the Democrat committee if it would consider jointly hosting the primaries, and the Democrat Central Committee agreed to do it, working together, the whole thrust being, let's make it easy for people to vote. Let's make it convenient for people to vote. Let's make it affordable for people to have elections. And so the process of joint polling places, where you go in and say, I want a Republican ballot or I want a Democrat ballot, that started in the 80s after Dick Barclay had been elected to the legislature. And once that happened, the trend started. And so that, of course, spilled over to other things. The quorum court in the early 80s, when I first started practicing law in 1976, was all Democrat except for, I think, maybe one Republican. Dale Rice, I think, was the lone Republican on the quorum court. Now, in 2022, it's 100% Republican. I don't believe there's a Democrat on the Benton County quorum court. that's just sort of been a change. But my wife served on the quorum court one term. She was appointed to fill a vacancy. My partner, George Rhodes, ran for the quorum court and was elected and served several terms. Dwayne Kirby, my old friend, and the guy that built my law office, he served on the Benton County quorum court. It was a good working bunch that took care of Benton County, and it still is. You know, even though it's a partisan election, the decisions that the quorum court makes are really not partisan based. They're trying to be sure that the county facilities work and are appropriate, that the county roads are drivable, that the county employees are fairly compensated. That's not a partisan issue. That's good governance, and I think by and large we get good governance in Benton County, whether the county judge is a Democrat or a Republican. Of course, the last Democrat county judge in Benton County was Al Norwood, who was also the mayor of Lowell when I started practicing law. Since then, it's of course been held by Republicans, all of whom are good folks. I told you that Al Norwood was the county judge when I actually after I started practicing law. I think he got elected in 1980. Rayleigh Steele had been the county judge. He actually he took my seat in the Arkansas legislature when I didn't run again. Rayleigh ran for state representative. Bruce Rutherford, who was a huge man physically, had been a Benton County deputy sheriff, and he ran for the county judge and won, and served, I think, 8 years, did a great job. Barry Mooring, who is our current county judge, is a brilliant man. He brings a vast experience from the business world into being the county judge, and I think he's been a very good spokesman for Benton County. He's led the county through some very difficult and contentious decisions about county facilities, but he's always done it with grace and dignity, and he's had meetings throughout the county that he's gone and listened to people's compliments and complaints, and of course of late people are more inclined to complain than they are to compliment, but I think Judge Mooring has done and is doing a good job. I think that the biggest issue Judge Mooring faces now is the jail, the future of the jail. Benton County has grown, and with it the need for jail facilities has grown. It's a huge difference. Back when I started practicing law in 1976, the jail was a small building right behind the county courthouse, and there was no public defender system when I started practicing law. People can't remember that. Everybody had a right to be represented by a lawyer, and so Judge Enfield, the circuit judge, kept a list of all of the lawyers that practiced in Benton County, and you just take your turn. He'd call you up and say, David, I've got a guy over in jail, and he's been charged with possession of marijuana, and I need you to represent him. Okay, Judge, we didn't get paid for it. That was our obligation as lawyers to provide a defense for the indigent, and we all took our turns. But you'd go over to visit with a jail inmate, and they'd put you in a room that was, it wouldn't even qualify as a closet. They had a little stool that each one sat on and a fold-up table that came between you, so you're sitting knee to knee and about nose to nose, about that far from a person. In my case, the first person I was appointed to represent had committed a number of burglaries. He later once he'd been back to jail and gotten out, he later committed a murder and was found guilty of a murder and is still in prison today. But so here I am, 25 years old, sitting knee to knee, face to face with a hardened criminal in a closet. And, they locked the door behind you. It was a kind of a scary deal, but they'd only have about 20 or 30 inmates at a time. And now there's in the hundreds of inmates.
Well, what's changed over the time where we have so many more inmates now? I know we have population, but is it more than that?
I don't really think so. I think it's just population, and with population and prosperity, and of course Benton County is one of the most prosperous areas of the country, but with prosperity comes folks that don't always mean well. They think the prosperity of others means an opportunity for them to steal something. I told you I grew up in Lowell and everybody was always felt safe. last June, I had a car stolen out of the garage in my home with my wife and I and 2 grandkids upstairs asleep. Now, that would have never happened back in the 70s or 80s, but in 2021, it happened to me. And, it's just people that come here and say, oh, all these folks that work for Walmart or sell stuff to Walmart or practice law or practice medicine, I just will help myself to some of their things. Or they get captured in the vortex of drugs, and it takes them down to the point that finally they can't feed their habit in illegal means, and so they resort to crime, and we put them in jail. There are sheriffs who are memorable. For me, Don Townsend comes to mind, because I knew Don when he was in the CID at the Benton County Sheriff's Office, and he did a great job. He ran for sheriff and was elected, and was a terrific sheriff, in my opinion. Claude Penn was a good sheriff. Also came up through the ranks. Was a former deputy that then became sheriff. Probably the most colorful sheriff in my time, and certainly the most controversial, was Andy Lee. Andy just had a way with words and an air for the flamboyant. It seemed like during the years that Andy was sheriff, he was constantly in the news. And then contrast that, he gets followed by a beloved Arkansas State Trooper. Keith Ferguson started his police department, his police work as a state trooper in Benton County when he was probably in his mid-20s. About the time my generation was graduating from high school, he probably gave every boy from Rogers High School class of 1969 a traffic ticket somewhere along the way. But he was always nice about it, and he gave me a ticket once when I was working at Holiday Inn, and then Leon Clinton, his senior state trooper, loaned me the money to pay the ticket. But Keith finished his career as a state trooper and retired, and then ran for sheriff. Just the complete opposite in terms of controversy or being in the news. Keith came in and ran an excellent sheriff's department and never made the news. He did not have controversy. I think the sheriff's deputies all liked him and respected him, but we've had an excellent law enforcement program in Benton County, actually throughout all the years. Even though Andy was controversial and in the news, we had a very good sheriff's department, and really always have. Sean Holloway, of course, is the sheriff now, and although I have quit practicing law in the criminal field, as a result of that, I don't have much occasion to go to the jail. In fact, I haven't done any criminal law since the late tens. But what I hear about Sheriff Holloway is that he's competent and does a good job, and that once again that the deputies like him and respect him and enjoy working for him. That's the key. The sheriff sets the tone for a sheriff's department, and if you've got someone that is rude and not considerate of others, that's going to spill out into the deputies, and they're going to treat people that way. That's not Sean Holloway based on what I've seen and heard. He's respectful. He treats people with respect, and he expects his officers to treat people with respect, and I think they do.
And what about some of the prosecutors that stand out over the years?
Well, there's, in my estimation, in having practiced law now for 47 years, the standard by which every prosecutor ought to be measured is David Klinger. David and I practiced law in the private sector for a while. He ran for prosecuting attorney as a Democrat. He defeated an old boy named Asa Hutchinson. Most people don't remember that. I think that was Asa's first run for public office. He ran for sheriff. He ran for prosecuting attorney as a Republican. David Klinger beat him. Klinger would always, he never was defeated, but he did change parties along the way. As part of this shift that we've talked about earlier, all of the judges and the prosecutor changed parties. Tom Keith, who was the chairman, and went from being the chairman of the Democratic Party to a Republican elected circuit judge. But David Klinger was by far the most adept prosecutor that I ever dealt with, and I don't want to take anything away from some of the others, some of whom had some ethical problems and were removed from office, but most of the prosecutors have been excellent, including our current prosecutor, Nathan Smith. But David Klinger was extraordinary. I mean, he was thorough. When he was prosecuting attorney, there were only 3 prosecutors. The chief prosecutor, David, and then he had Zolly Duncan, who later became his wife and later became a circuit judge in her own right. She was a deputy prosecutor, and Kevin Pollack was a deputy prosecutor. And the 3 of them handled all of the cases. I promise you this, I've tried hundreds of lawsuits, tried hundreds of cases against some of the best lawyers in the state. I never tried a case against a lawyer that was any better than David Klinger, and I never tried a case against a lawyer that was better prepared than David Klinger. He could prepare a case for trial like nobody I have ever seen. He left no detail untouched.
What are some examples you can think of?
Well, I tried a case against him for 7 days. A client of mine named David Blankenship was charged with murder. He had been defending his property on Highway 71 between Rogers and Bentonville. He had an auto salvage place, and he was being robbed. And so he went there and spent the night with a gun. And a 15-year-old kid came rattling around, and David went out to try to apprehend him and ended up shooting him. He shot him in the back. And then he brought him from the ditch where he had been shot up to the front door of his business. David Klinger is the one who went to the scene that night. It was David Klinger who was looking at the body. It was David Klinger who realized there's not one shot in the back, there are 2. One shot in the back and one shot in the boy's elbow that was hard to see. Klinger found it, and based upon the fact that there were not 1 shot but 2 that were fired, he concluded that it was more than just a self-defense shooting. We tried the case for 7 days, and my client was convicted. And I'll say he was convicted of a lesser included offense. The jury believed a substantial amount of the defense's case, but it was the second bullet that got him, and David Klinger is the one that found it, and he found it that night at the scene before the body had ever gone to the state medical examiner. He was thorough.
And is that not something every prosecutor would have done?
No, I doubt seriously that the chief prosecutor visits the scenes of crimes in the middle of the night these days. I may be wrong, but David Klinger was all about trying to get to the truth. And he prepared a case better than anybody.
Good. Any of the other ones you can think of that stand out?
Well, the first prosecutor when I started practicing law was a guy named Gary Kennan, and he was a very nice man and did a good job. Then David Klinger had the job for so long, I've actually forgotten all the ones that came after him. There was, of course, a prosecutor named Butler who had some difficulties that resulted in his resignation. But David Klinger was the prosecutor that will always stand out in my mind. He did the job that needed to be done, even when it was hard. And I'll give you an example. Everyone in the legal profession loved Josephine Highland. Josephine was the circuit clerk since Moses was a road guard. She had been the circuit clerk forever. But David discovered that there were some financial improprieties. I forget now the extent of what they were, but they were there. And David, who ran on the same ticket as she did, had known her his whole career too. He had the unfortunate task of confronting her with what she had done and ultimately prosecuting her and forcing her out of office. I know it wasn't easy for him. I know it would have been easier for him to not prosecute or perhaps go behind the scenes and say, you need to quit doing that. David had such a sense of justice and such a absolute compulsion to see that justice was done that he couldn't do that. He had to enforce the law everywhere against everybody, even people that he knew and liked. I always respected him for that.
What about the judges? You've known a lot of the judges. Who are some of the, and some of the ones were prosecutors too, but who are some of the judges?
Well, when I started practicing law, we had some judges that were legendary in my mind, and still are. I've had the opportunity through 47 years of practicing law to practice in front of lots and lots of judges. And I will stop now and say this. We have, in my opinion, the best panel of judges in Benton County that there is in the state of Arkansas. The judges that serve us now, I would put up against any judge anywhere in the state. They are all excellent. When I began my career, we only had 2 judges in Benton County. You can't even comprehend that now. I think Benton County's now got 7 circuit judges. When I started practicing law in 1976, we had 2, a circuit judge, William Enfield, and a chancery judge named Ted Coxey. Ted Coxey was legendary. He had been the prosecuting attorney for Washington County, Benton County, Carroll County, and Madison County. Those 4 counties made up a judicial circuit. He was the prosecutor for all 4 counties for over 20 years. And then as the counties grew and Benton and Carroll County became a separate circuit, he ran for ran for chancery judge and was elected. People could not imagine this, but from 1976 until 1978 when he retired, he only came to Benton County 2 days a week. He would take default divorces on Mondays, and he would schedule trials for Wednesdays. Otherwise, there was no chancery judge. Now, chancery judge, that's the person who does divorces, who did cases that involved real estate, cases that involved probate. That was all the chancery judge. And Benton County had a judge doing it basically a day and a half a week, because when he was done with default divorces, he went back to Carroll County. It's just inconceivable. Now we have 7 judges for just Benton County alone, and they're all busy as they can be. But that was Judge Coxey. He was notorious in his belief that children needed to be raised by their mothers, not their fathers. I had a case once where a woman had left her husband, just left him with 2 kids. And he had no choice but to file for divorce, and so we go over to present ourselves to take the divorce case and ask for custody of the children. And Judge Coxey whirled in his chair about midway through my examination and said, "Young man, do you know the recipe for cornbread?" And my client said, "Well, no, sir, I don't." Divorce denied. Nobody can raise 2 kids that can't cook cornbread. And then he looked at him and he said, "Now you go home and you call that wife of yours and tell her that the judge said for her to come home and help you raise those kids." Well, he did, and she did. He went home and called her. She came back. They stayed together for about another 9 months, and then it came time for a divorce again. That was Judge Coxey. Judge Enfield, on the other hand, was he and Tom Butt in Washington County set the standard for judges as far as I'm concerned. Judge Enfield, people did not realize the giant that he was in Benton County. He had been a lawyer, partners with Clayton Little, and when the redistricting happened that I talked about earlier, he ran for circuit judge of Benton and Carroll County and was elected. Prior to being a lawyer and a judge, Bill Enfield had been the youngest line officer in the United States Marine Corps during World War II. He was a decorated war hero, as was Clayton Little. He had served a time as the Benton County judge. There had been a vacancy, and he filled it, and so basically he was the administrator of the county, and then, of course, left and practiced law. He's the lawyer that prepared the original corporate work for a little company called Walmart. Walmart. He was Sam Walton's personal lawyer. He and Sam remained friends until they both died. But Judge Enfield was a pilot. He was an accomplished pianist. He was an artist. He was a Renaissance man, and he was one tough judge. Lawyers would gather before court in his chambers, and he was a great raconteur. He would come out and visit and hail fellow well met, nicest guy in the world, great storyteller. Then he'd put on the robe and go in and take the bench, and you wanted to watch your P's and Q's, because he was not going to put up with any shenanigans. When I first started practicing law, I went over to watch a trial because the famed Clayton Little was trying a jury case in front of Judge Enfield. And I've been a lawyer about 3 weeks. So I'm sitting over there watching. And about midway through the trial, Clayton Little, who was feisty, jumped up to make an objection, and he did it in a loud way. And Judge Enfield, who had always worked with a number 2 pencil, he had a pencil in his hand, and he threw it down on the docket book, and it hits and bounces up in the air and comes twirling down, and I'm just sitting there in shock. And he points at his best friend, Clayton Little, law partner, and says, "Now don't you do that again." I sat back and thought, oh my Lord, if he'll do that to his best friend, I don't have a chance. So I was always careful in Judge Enfield's court not to offend.
Any other judges that stand out?
Well, they all stand out. John Earl Jennings, whom I clerked for, later became the Rogers Municipal Judge, and then a Chancery Judge. That he was a Chancery Judge when it got converted to being a Circuit Judge. He then ran for the Arkansas Court of Appeals and served a substantial part of his time there as the Chief Judge of the Arkansas Court of Appeals. Brilliant mind, brilliant judge. Of course, David Klinger went from being a prosecutor to being a circuit judge, and did a wonderful job. I told you earlier that Zolly Duncan had been a deputy prosecutor with David Klinger. They ultimately married, and then she ran for judge as well. Zolly Duncan is a great judge. She mostly handles divorce cases, but as a circuit judge, she can also try jury trials, and so she has a broad understanding of the law and exposure to all of the various types of law, and she does a super job. So does John Scott, so does Doug Sarantz. Judge Scott has the best command of his courtroom of anybody that I've ever seen anywhere, and I've tried lawsuits all over the state of Arkansas and in federal court. But Judge Scott is pleasant, he's cordial, he's respectful, but he has command. If a witness is not answering a question, Judge Scott will let him go about 3 times not answering the question, and then he'll stop the proceeding. And he might say to you, "Mr. Davis, do you understand the question that's being asked you?" "Well, yes, sir, I do." "Then answer it. We've been over this now 3 times. You need to answer the question that's asked. And if you don't do that, then I'm going to have to give you some time out to think about it." And I've seen him take witnesses off the stand and send them to the county jail to reflect upon their responsiveness. So, of course, we all know that. And so a good lawyer is going to prepare his witness. Since Judge Scott, since I saw that happen, I've never gone to court in his court yet that I didn't say to the witness, "You are at jeopardy of losing your freedom for a while if you don't answer the questions that are asked." Don't argue with the lawyer. You answer the question. If the judge asks you a question, you sure answer it, and you answer it directly. No beating around the bush. John is in command of his courtroom. Judge Sarantz and I practiced law with each other for many, many years, and he's been an excellent judge as well. He's had to make some hard decisions on child custody cases and In my instance, I had a case that was a difficult probate matter between brothers, and he listens carefully to the testimony, takes copious notes, and he doesn't hesitate to make his ruling. As I said before, the judges we have in Benton County are as good as any judges anywhere. Like everybody that's in the law, I've watched some of the more famous trials in America. The O.J. Simpson trial comes to mind. I promise you, the lawyers and the judges in Benton County are way better than those lawyers and judges were. Well, the highest profile case that I ever worked on was not tried in Benton County. It began as a class action lawsuit by a little school district in East Arkansas called Lakeview, and it challenged the funding for the Arkansas public education system. Rogers and Bentonville, I represented Rogers for many years, but then Bentonville and Rogers joined together, and they hired me to represent the two districts in that lawsuit. Originally, my task was to protect the funding formula that was in place, because it finally was basing school funding on the number of students, and because Rogers and Bentonville were rapidly growing, they needed the funding to be based upon that. The whole debate had been whether or not there were phantom students. I could spend more time than you or any listener would have any interest in talking about the intricacies. But along the way, the nature of that lawsuit changed. A judge named Collins Kilgore in Little Rock determined that in order to judge the constitutionality of the Arkansas funding system, he had to look at not only the equitable division of school money, but the adequacy of it as well. Adequacy meaning how much money goes into educational funding. When that ruling was made, Rogers and Bentonville changed its position, and I went from supporting the law to challenging the law. And those two school districts had the courage to say, now that you've asked, Judge, the reality is we're not doing as good a job as we could do for our students if we had more adequate funding. And it was a watershed moment in education funding in Arkansas. The Lakeview case went to the Supreme Court 3 or 4 different times. It was the subject of 2 or 3 special sessions of the Arkansas legislature. But Arkansas went from dead last in every meaningful ranking in education circles to ahead of all of its neighboring states in teacher salaries, in achievement levels. We haven't yet been able to crack the need to have more people in Arkansas seeking higher education, but it's a work in progress. We said that 22 years ago in the Lakeview case. Education reform is a journey, it's not a destination. You've got to stay with it. And so that was clearly the highest profile case that I've ever worked on. But there were other high-profile cases in Benton County that I was, not a part of. One of them, probably the one that drew the biggest crowds through the years, was a case against a man named Roger Dale Logan, who was charged with the homosexual assault of the profoundly disabled children at the Sunshine School. And you talk about pitting two giants of trial law in Northwest Arkansas, David Klinger for the prosecution and John Everett, whom I believe to be your friend. John is from Prairie Grove, a great trial lawyer, and he represented Mr. Logan in the second trial. People would line up at the courthouse steps to get a seat in the large courtroom at Benton County to watch that trial. It was jam-packed, emotional, a crowd every day. And the testimony would bring tears to the eyes of people in the audience and even in the jury box. It was a very high-profile case, very high-profile.
What was the resolution of the case?
He was convicted twice. He'd been convicted once. It got reversed for a procedural error and tried again, and he was convicted again. David Klinger was prepared. the history of Benton County law is replete with funny moments, touching moments, sad moments, historic moments. I want to go back to Judge Enfield. Early in my law practice, the real most tragic event that happened in law enforcement ended up being an important and high-profile case as well. There were 3 black transient prisoners in the Benton County Jail who overpowered a deputy sheriff named Ed Rose and killed him. And of course, that was a shocking event in Benton County. To have a law enforcement officer killed in the jail, shocking. They were charged. Gary Kennan was the prosecutor. I'm not sure that I said that, but Gary Kennan was the prosecutor, and so he, of course, charged them with murder at about the same time that the death penalty came back into being legal. You know, there was a period of time in the early 70s where the death penalty was ruled unconstitutional, and then that law was changed and it became available again as a remedy. The Southern Law Poverty Fund was so concerned that these 3 black inmates would not get a fair trial in Benton County that they sent a lawyer named Morris Dees. Morris Dees would later become very prominent as one of the primary fundraisers for Jimmy Carter when he was running for president, and Morris Dees is and was legendary in the law, particularly in advocating for the disadvantaged. But he came to Benton County, Arkansas to be the defense lawyer against Gary Kennan for these 3 men that were charged with the crime. He came concerned that they would not get a fair trial. After being here for about a month, he satisfied himself that because of Judge William Enfield and his commitment to fairness and to justice and to the fact that these young men were going to get a fair trial, that he felt comfortable enough to remove himself from the case and allow other lawyers to proceed. And they did get a trial. They did not get the death penalty. They certainly got a severe penalty. As I recall, it was life in prison. But the fact that a lawyer of national renown would come to Benton County with a suspicion that they would be railroaded and leave convinced they have a great judge who will give them a fair trial, who will see that all the rules are followed, that, I think, embodied the nature of practice law in Benton County. The judges have uniformly been good. Have they made errors in their decisions? Of course. Sometimes errors get committed. The greatest judges that ever were have all had their cases appealed and in some instances been reversed. But no one, to my knowledge, has ever been able to say that you don't get a fair trial in Benton County. You don't have an impartial judge. You do. The judges are good, and they, to a person, male or female, Republican or Democrat, or now nonpartisan, they have always been committing to doing the right thing. You know, during my career, I've had the opportunity to rub shoulders with a lot of lawyers. First, the ones that were much older than me, lawyers like Jeff Duty, lawyers like J. Wesley Sampier. I've talked already about my friend Gene Kelly and what he did for me. But then there are some other lawyers that have come along that are younger than me, but just super lawyers. You know, I've not had a case against him, but I've worked with a young lawyer named Satch Oliver. And I'm telling you, he can try a lawsuit, but he can prepare a lawsuit too. But one of his sidelines is he works up mock trials, mock juries, so that trial lawyers, either for the defense or the prosecution, or a plaintiff's case, can basically submit their case to jurors, people that meet the demographics of the jury panel of whatever county you're in, and you present your case and you get some feel for what a jury might do. He's brilliant at that, and has been an aid to me in several cases, and I know to lots of other lawyers across the state of Arkansas. Of course, you can't talk about great trial lawyers in in Benton County without talking about John Everett. I mentioned him earlier as being the defense lawyer in the case involving the Sunshine School. John has the most facile mind of any person I've ever known. A witness makes a statement that John can latch on to, and there he goes. Now you got another 10 minutes of cross-examination, and by the time he's done, the witness feels like he's been completely derobed. But even John got taken advantage of by a witness once. It's a story that he tells. I'm not talking out of school. I've used it as an example many times about being careful what you say. In the very case that we talked about, the Roger Dale Logan case, then Prosecutor Klinger had finally gotten one of the victims able to testify. By that time he was in his young 20s. He was profoundly disabled, but he could talk. His name was Jimmy. And Jimmy got on the stand to testify about the things that had happened to him. Before he got to testify, Judge Enfield wanted to wanted to know, does he understand the obligation of the oath? And so he asked Jimmy, do you understand what it means to swear to tell the truth? And Jimmy looked at him and said, yes, Judge, God won't like it if you lie. And Judge Enfield said, he's qualified. And he began to testify, and his testimony was devastating to the defendant. John Everett, it came his time to cross-examine. And he knew, as all good lawyers know, you can't beat up a witness that is infirm, elderly, disabled. You can't not show compassion to a witness. And so John said, I couldn't just say no questions. I have to ask him something. So he went up and asked a few basic questions. And as he was finishing, John, in his colorful, theatric way, picked up his paper and started walking back to his desk. And he looked over his shoulder and he said, thank you, Jimmy, for telling us your story today. And Jimmy leaned into the microphone and said, it ain't no story, Mr. Everett. It's the truth. And the audience exploded in applause. The jury was crying. And John says to me later, and when I sat down, I thought to myself, Roger Dale Logan, you're going to prison. It ain't no story, Mr. Everett. It's the truth. One of the things that has made practicing law in Benton County profitable and enjoyable and varied has been this incredible growth that we've experienced. That really drove all components of society. Not only does it make traffic terrible, it made our school systems overcrowded, but our school systems responded. I promise you this: Rogers, Bentonville, Siloam Springs, Pea Ridge, Gentry, Gravette, Decatur, all have great school systems, but especially that's so in Rogers and Bentonville, because the growth that has come has increased the tax base. It's brought in folks with an understanding of the importance of education, and that has helped. But as we talked about earlier, it has also brought in folks that moved here from areas where there was not a good education ethic, and we've had an awful lot of kids present themselves at our doors that were not prepared for the grade that they would be chronologically assigned to. All of the school districts have worked hard to recognize the students that are behind and figure out a way to improve them, and that's why the scores are as excellent as they are in any ranking of school systems in the nation. Rogers and Bentonville, Siloam Springs, Pea Ridge in particular, are going to rank very high And that's not an accident. It's because the communities here have had an education ethic. They've elected good school board members. They've hired good superintendents who have hired good other administrators and have hired great teachers. And it's sort of a hand-in-glove thing, Scott. Having a good education system has made it possible for the growth to be sustained. But you can measure, as I look back at, here in my life, I'm looking more through the rearview mirror than I am the windshield. The single thing that changed everything for Benton County was Beaver Lake. Absent Beaver Lake, you don't have the water supply to support the poultry industry. Absent Beaver Lake, you don't have the recreational opportunity to allow folks like Sam Walton to entice people to come and work at his what was a 5 and dime store that turned into the largest corporation in America. Absent Beaver Lake, you don't have the great resources that we've got to sustain the growth. Now you add to that some incredible individuals who saw the future of Benton County. People like Sam Walton, but you can't discount guys like J.B. Hunt and women like John L. Hunt either, and people like John A. Cooper Sr., who saw what could happen up here. So you have the rare combination of natural resources, a central location, a workforce, people that wanted to make their places better. I think of the group of Rogers businessmen who wanted to take this town from being a population of 4,000 or 5,000 into a growing community. They knew they had to have some manufacturing jobs. So the business people, not the government, the business people got together and went on a field trip to Michigan to entice a guy named Cass Huff to locate Daisy Manufacturing in Rogers. And when he did that, he brought with him a whole set of folks like Gerald K. King and many others who moved down here from Michigan and brought with them a commitment to education. Lots of folks don't remember that Dave Gates, who was an executive at Daisy, came here from Michigan with Daisy, but he'd served a number of years as the chairman of the school board in Rogers during a time of growth and expansion, and helped instill this education ethic that I keep talking about. We've just been blessed here with good people, Beaver Lake, the beautiful land that we live on, and then the opportunities for folks. It's been a wonderful place to live, to grow a law practice. But I'd still twitch my nose and take us back to 1968 if I could. If I were asked by a stranger to describe Benton County, I would say it is a place where anybody that wants to work hard can succeed. I would say it's a place where you have the opportunity to worship however you want to worship, or if you don't want to worship. I'd say it's a place where if you want to have recreational activities, they are abundant. You have a lake that's wonderful to fish on, to swim in, to boat on. We now have, thanks to the generosity and vision of the youngest generation of Waltons, we now have a world-class biking opportunity that's available for people of all ages, a place to walk, a place to bike. My wife and I'm 71 and she's 68, and we just bought e-bikes. An e-bike means, that's a fancy word for it's an electric bicycle that helps you pedal, but it's opened up great opportunities for us that to get out and to stay active. The Bella Vista community provides ample opportunity for socialization of folks in their retirement years and for golfing opportunities, but also affordable housing for young families. It's been a tremendous addition to Benton County. Benton County just offers it all. It's centrally located to the United States. It's got an excellent airport. It's got excellent interstate highways to get you where you want to go by car, or if you're selling goods, by truck. We have the benefit of the railroad. That's what brought Rogers into being in the first place. It's just, it's the place where you can live out and fulfill the American dream.